Hey guys, this is Andrew Price from blenderguru.com. The reason I'm speaking now from a different website is because it's to promote the new ebook that I'm writing at the moment called The Wow Factor. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the video, but right now what I want to talk about is the Compositor. Now, the Compositor seems to me to be one of the most misunderstood or confused topics within Blender, because possibly since the start of when I started Blender Guru a year ago, I've had possibly over 100 emails from people asking questions about the Compositor, like what can you do with it, what is it for, what is the Compositor, things like that. So I thought I'd just take the time to answer a few of those questions now in this video. So I hope you enjoy it and I hope you get something from it. Alright, so let's start with the basics. What is the Compositor? The Compositor can be used to add effects, make adjustments, or combine elements within the render to produce a more polished final image. So for example, I took this image straight out of Blender, and by putting it through the Compositor, I've completely changed the look of the image. So I've added glow effects, vignetting, depth of field, a whole range of different effects within the Compositor to completely change the final effect of the image. So how does it work? Now, this may sound a little bit funny, but the best way to understand the Compositor is to imagine a food conveyor belt. Okay, so stay with me for a second. So let's say you take a piece of food, you place it on the conveyor belt, and then as it moves along, machines step in and they change things. They also add things and they take things away from this meal that's moving along the conveyor belt. Then when it reaches the end of the conveyor belt, a final product is declared. That is essentially what the Compositor is doing. You start at the start of the conveyor belt, you have your render layer, okay, that's this starting block here. Then as it moves down the conveyor belt, which is called the node string, it reaches the end point, which is known as the composite node. Now in that time, nodes can step in, such as this one here, and change things. So for example, this one here is changing the brightness and the contrast of the image. So you can put in an image into at the start of the conveyor belt, then as it moves down, it gets changed and it spits out a completely different image. So that's what the Compositor is for. Now you might hear me mention a lot of times nodes. The word node is used a lot in compositing. That's because each of these little boxes here, they're called nodes. They each have a different job they serve within Blender. And they each do different things, they each adjust different things. But they are what you're using to change the effect of the image. Now every single node, well not every single node, but most nodes have an input and an output. There are other types, but just to keep it basic, that is essentially what most of them have. So basically you connect the nodes by taking the output of one node and connecting it into the input of another, and you form a long chain with it. Now the output of one node can be split multiple times, as many times as you like. So for example, this is being split up into three different nodes here. Now unlike the outputs, you can only fit one input, one node string into the input of an image. So for example, in this one here, you couldn't just take all three of these the outputs of these image and put it into this node here, because that's not the way it works. To combine multiple nodes, you need to use what's called mix nodes. Now hopefully I don't confuse you too much, but to put it very simply, basically with these, it's taking the two streams and forming them into one. So to get all three of these nodes combined into one output, you need to use two mix nodes. I hope that makes sense. It's okay if it doesn't, it's not essential for now. Are you confused? It's okay to be confused when you first look at the Compositor. It can look like rubbish a lot of the time, just strings and boxes going everywhere. But just remember, in the future, if you ever have a look at a screenshot of someone's node setup and you get confused at what's going on, all you need to remember is to read from left to right. Because basically, if you start on the left-hand side at the render layer and then follow each of these lines down, you can see each of them as they connect into the different nodes, and you can see what effect they are performing on the image. Alright, so now that's the basics out of the way, let's move into a practical tutorial. Now in this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to take this standard image here and transform it into this one here. So what we're going to be doing is adding glow and glare effects to this green man object in the center here, as well as a final background image, which is going to give a nice, more visually engaging final image. Okay, so switching now to the Blender file. I know here, as you can see, I've got the selected green man object, okay? Now I know that I will need this separated from the rest of the scene, because we only want to apply glare and glow effects to that object, not the rest of the scene. So first thing we need to do is move it to a separate layer. So we press M, and I'm going to move it to layer 2. Okay, so we've got the whole scene, or most of the scene, on layer 1, except the green man object, which is now on layer 2. Okay, now we're going to move up here to the render settings options. Now if we click the arrow next to layers, we get this drop down here and you get more options. Now this can get a little bit confusing, so stay with me. But now this is the render layer options, okay? Now render layers are different to layers in Blender, okay? There's physical layers that we've got here, and then there's the render layers up there. Now render layers define what parts or what physical layers in Blender are going to be rendered into the Compositor. Okay, and it'll make sense in a minute when we go to the Compositor, and I'll show you. Okay, now by default there's only one render layer here, and it's rendering the entire scene as one lump render layer. So we're going to change that. We're going to call this scene, so we can find it easier in a second. And I'm just going to make that layer 1, because that's where our pole and everything else is. Okay, so it's just on layer 1. Now I'm going to add a separate render layer, and I'm going to call this green man. And of course, I'm going to select layer 2, because that's where our green man is. Okay, so that's going to be rendered into a separate render layer from the rest of the scene. Now the only other thing we need to change on this screen is we need to turn off the sky option. The sky option will render the default grey background into the image, into the render layer, which we don't want. So we're going to turn it off for both of those render layers there. Okay, now before we switch to the Compositor, there's one thing we need to do. We need to re-render the image. Okay, because anytime you make changes to render layers, you need to re-render the image before it will come into effect into Blender. So let's do that now. Okay, so once that's finished rendering, we can now move to the Compositor. Now you can access the Compositor one of two ways. You can select it from the drop-down menu here and click Node Editor, or you can do what I do and just press Control left arrow. That will switch you to the compositing workflow. Now, when you first open it, you should see something like this, where it's just got the default render layer connected directly to the composite node. So we can disconnect those two because we don't need the composite node for now. Now, as you can see here, this is a render layer. This is where you're going to be putting parts of your Blender scene into the Compositor to start editing. So this is the scene render layer. As default, it's selected that. But if we press this button here, you can see we've got the two options there. We could select the green man as well as the scene, like so. Now we need both of those. So let's go ahead and add another render layer. So we go Shift A, Input, Render Layers. Okay, and I'm going to select green man from the drop down list. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start adding effects to just this green man, and it's not going to affect the rest of the scene now. Okay, so first and foremost, I want to add a thick glow to the green man to just sort of simulate, you know, the light shining out of it and hitting the air particles. Okay, so I'm going to go Shift A and select Filter and go Blur. Okay. Now, most of the time, the blur you're going to be using is called a fast Gaussian blur. That's the most common type. It's really quick, really
really easy type of blur. Now the X and Y value, that defines how big to make the blur or the glow effect. Okay, now because this is going to be the thick one, we're going to set this to 150 for both of those. Now if you want to see the effect that at any time through when you're editing, what you need to do is add a viewer node. So you go Shift A, Output, and select Viewer. Okay, now you've got a small viewer box there. You can see a sort of a green smudge. It's not very big. Now what you can do is, if you've got the viewer selected there, if you go down here and click Backdrop, it will add it into the background and you can see what you're working on then. So as you can see, it's looking pretty good. It's a fairly decent sized glow for what we want. However, it is looking a little bit dull for what I need. So what I'm going to add next is an RGB curve. Okay, let's just get rid of that for now. Okay, and now an RGB curve, without going into too much detail, that allows you to increase brightness and contrast and other things like that, as well as color channels. I don't have a lot of time to go into it now. But all we want to do now is just bump up the brightness of that blur. So I take that and I plug it straight into the input there of the RGB curve. Now if we add another viewer node there, just to see what the effect is, you can see it's looking slightly brighter. So we can increase it or decrease it, things like that. So it's a very useful node, this RGB curve. You'll find it's used a lot when you're doing compositing. Okay, so now we've got the thick glow out of the way. Now we want a smaller, brighter glow to be just surrounding the green man. We don't want it very big though. So I'm going to add another blur node. Select Filter, go to Blur, and connect it directly with the render layer, like so. And now from this drop down list, again, I'm going to select Fast Gaussian, but for the X and Y value, I'm going to set that to 15. So it's a lot smaller than the other one. But if we add a viewer node, you can see the different effect it has. There you go. So it's a lot more smaller of a glow, and it's a lot thicker, and yeah, it produces a nice glowing effect on the green man. But again, it's not very bright. Okay, so I'm going to increase that again. Going to add another RGB curve, and I'm going to increase it a little bit more than the other ones. Let's increase it to about there. As you can see, yeah, it's brightened it up in the background there. Yeah, probably about there. Obviously, yeah, a lot of compositing is to do with experimenting, so you want to play around with these values compared to what you've got in your scene. Alright, and finally, what I'm going to be adding is one of my favorite nodes. It's called the glare node. Now, this glare node allows you to... Hang on a second. It's plugging it in weirdly there. Yeah, the glare node allows you to add those light streak effects to an object. So with this glare node plugged in, I'm going to add a viewer node so you can see what we're working on. Okay. Now, as you can see here, you've got different sort of effects you can add. You've got ghosts, streaks, fog glow, things like that. Most of the time, you're just going to be using the one called streaks. Okay, now I'm going to increase the iterations to 5. The iterations defines the overall quality of the glare. So 5 is maximum. And now we want to decrease the threshold. Threshold defines how much of it to blur. Now we want to go ahead and just glare everything. So there you go. Now you can actually see the effect there. Okay, that's what we're going to be adding. Now for this one, I want to increase the number of streak effects. So currently it's 4, so it's just got this sort of cross look to it. So increase that to 7. And it it gives you a much nicer result. The only other sort of options I'm going to be tinkering with is the fade value. The fade just defines how long to make the glare. So if we increase that upwards like so, you can see, yeah, it goes. You can really go nuts with some of these effects. But yeah, I'm just going to make mine 0.91. So it's just slightly longer than the default. And the other one you might be tinkering with, color modulation. That adds some more randomized look to the glare, such as yeah, it gives you this sort of chromatic aberration sort of look to it. But I'm just going to go ahead and turn that off because I don't really need that. The other one you might be using is the mix. Now mix defines like a sort of 50-50 mix of the original image. That's what 0 is. But if you change it to 1, it's just the effect, not the original image. However, I want the original image because it's going to make the green man look brighter. And that's what we're trying to do eventually anyway. So, Alright, so having a look there, we've now got the three effects. We've got the thick glow, the small glow here, and then we've got the glare. Now what we spoke about in the slideshow, you might remember, is to combine more than one effect, you need to use what's called a mix node. So let's go ahead and add one of those. You press Shift A, go to color, and select mix. You'll find a lot of these. You'll find yourself using these a lot. Okay. Okay. Now there is a lot of confusion. A lot of people confused on how to combine things effectively. Because you've got all these different options here. If you've used Photoshop or GIMP before, you'll sort of notice these. You've got overlay, divide, lighten, dodge, things like that. But basically, without getting too complicated, because I don't really have time in this tutorial, but if it is a light value, such as what we've got here, this green luminance value, it needs to be either screen or add. If it's a dark value, such as a shadow or something like that, then you'd be using multiply. We're going to use screen because, as I said, it's a light value. Now I'm going to add the outputs from both of these RGB curves and just plug it straight into the mix node there, like so. Now if we add a viewer node, you can see the effect there. The only other value you need to change is this FAC value. By default, it's 0.5, which seems a bit silly to me because that is 50% of the opacity for the bottom one. That's what it's defining. It's the opacity of the bottom input. Now, it should really be 1 by default, but anyway, you just have to make sure you always change that. Make sure it's 1 for most things you need it for. Okay, so now we've combined the thick glow and the small glow together into one output. Now we just need to combine the glow. So similar to what we just did there, I'm just going to duplicate that just to save time. And I'm going to connect it straight from that mix node into one of those inputs. And I'm going to take this output from the glare and plug it straight into the other input there, like so. Now if we add a viewer node, you can see we now have all three effects combined together into one. So as you can see, it's looking rather nice so far. Alright, so now what we would need to do is just to basically add this to the render scene. But before we do that, I want to show you just one other thing you can do with compositing that's really helpful. Instead of adding a background image within Blender and having to re-render it every time, you can actually add it directly into the compositor. So to do that, you can go to Input and select Add Image. Okay, then you select the image. I'm going to use this one that I've found on Flickr. Okay, and then we're just going to combine the two together. Now if it is a solid object such as this thing here, so it's the scene, it's got the pole and it's an actual object, you don't use a mix node for that. You use an alpha over node. So that's found in the color options there. Now we're just going to combine these two, use it very similarly just as you do a mix node. Just got the two inputs there, but it's just for solid objects. Now if we add a viewer node, you can see the effect it has there. So it's just basically, it's just pasted that image straight into the background there of the scene. The only thing I want to change though is you can see this bright area right here. It's really distracting the viewer from the final image, from this green man here. So really I want that part to be over there, and I want just the colored dot sort of lights to be there. So we can actually we can flip this image horizontally. So if we go press Shift A and we add a flip node. Now the flip node is really handy. Find it, use it sometimes. We only want to add it to just the image there, so that's why I'm pasting it right here. And I'm just going to connect it right there like so. And as you can see, it's had the effect, and it's flipped it horizontally like so. So it's looking really good now. Alright, now the final thing we need to do to seal the deal and combine everything as one is we need to combine this glare effect here with this one here. So what are we going to use? Yeah, you guessed it, another mix node. So go ahead, I've just duplicated that one. Going to keep the screen type, blending type to screen, and I'm just going to paste both of those into the input. And now if we add the viewer, another viewer port, you can see finally we have the final desired image there, like so. So as you can see, just by spending a few minutes in the Compositor, you can add some really nice effects to an otherwise boring render. Now this tutorial is really only scraping the surface of what can be achieved with the Compositor. It's a really vast system of different effects and things that can be achieved with it. In fact, you could almost write a book on it.
Hey, isn't that convenient? Somebody already has. So this is the ebook that I've written. It's called The Wow Factor, as you can see. Now, The Wow Factor is a guidebook for anybody who's serious about learning the Compositor. Now, I say guidebook because you don't actually need to read this book from cover to cover to understand it. Now, I know a lot of you guys are tight on time and you don't want to be reading a lot of irrelevant things. So I've designed it in the sense that if you want to learn how to pick up a soft glow or a depth of field and incorporate it into the scene you're working on, you can just open up the book and jump straight to the chapter. So each chapter begins with a brief introduction on the effect, as well as providing information on how it affects the camera lens in the real world, which is very important. It then launches into a thorough tutorial on every single effect. Now, every single setting and step is explained, and at the end of each tutorial, there's a final node setup screenshot, which is very handy if you know what you're doing and you just want to skim through the book and just quickly learn how to get the effect straight away. So I've designed the book to include pretty much every single effect and glare and all sorts of goodies like that occurs in the real world. So this is one that's you see a lot in MTV, music videos, movies and things like that, which is that sideways horizontal lens flare which you often see. So that is basically the book. I'm just flicking through a couple of pages here in no particular order, by the way. Now, if you're interested in reading some of the book right now, you can still get that free chapter that I was giving away before, which is on reflecting glare. So if you haven't got that yet, I'll make it available for a few more days. To get it, all you need to do is enter your email into the box on the right, and I'll email it to you. Well, that pretty much concludes the video. So if you have any questions about anything that was discussed in the tutorial or about this ebook, drop it in the comments below and I'll reply to it. So that's all from me. Thanks very much for watching.